They laughed at her at the table, as if she weren't even there. They laughed uproariously, matter-of-factly, like people who had never had to learn to defend themselves in silence. And I stayed quiet, not because I agreed, not because I accepted it, but because in that moment I realized something that no one else at that table noticed. I realized they were looking at a girl with no history, while I was beginning to understand that there was a whole story hidden behind those eyes, too attentive for their age. And when the truth began to emerge, piece by piece, I understood that that night hadn't just been a dinner. It had been the beginning of something that would forever change my view of the past, family, and belonging. I never planned to enter this story. I just wanted to give her a simple, stable, and predictable life. I wanted her to grow up thinking about school, friends, drawing, birthdays, and not questions about the beginning of life. But some stories don't ask if you're ready. They just arrive. First as a strange feeling, then as a coincidence, then as information you can no longer ignore. And before I knew it, I was in the middle of something bigger than documents, bigger than old records, bigger even than the decisions made years before I met her. I was in the middle of a human story, full of silences, attempts at care, unseen losses, and small gestures someone left behind, not knowing if they would ever be found. If someone had asked me before what defines a family, I would have given simple answers. Love, affection, presence. I still believe that today. But I also learned that some people are part of our story even when they can't be part of our lives. And understanding that difference was one of the hardest things I've had to learn. Because protecting someone doesn't always mean erasing the past. Sometimes it means ensuring that the past doesn't arrive as pain, but as a story understood, at the right time, with someone by your side holding your hand. I still didn't know where the story would lead. I didn't know how many answers there were or how many questions remained hidden. But one thing I was absolutely certain of after that dinner, whatever happened, I would never again let her face anything alone. Because some stories begin long before we arrive. But that doesn't mean they have to remain unresolved after we decide to stay. And that's how it all began. Not with a document, not with a connection, but with a laugh that made me realize there were parts of her story that no one at that table had dared to try to understand. I remember the smell of the food before I remember the laughter. It was late Sunday afternoon, with that golden light pouring through the window as if the day were slowly ending. The table was set with excessive care, a tablecloth too white for a house with so many people, dishes that only came out of the cupboard on special occasions, crystal glasses that hardly anyone used. My mother-in-law always believed that appearances were half of a family's dignity, and that day everything seemed designed to prove it. She sat beside me, small and quiet, trying to take up as little space as possible. Her dress was simple and clean, but clearly not the kind of clothing the family considered pretty. Her hair was pulled back in a crooked style, as if it had been combed too quickly or by hands still learning. But her eyes were too attentive for her age. Eyes that observed before trusting. Eyes of someone who had already learned that understanding her surroundings could be a matter of emotional survival. My husband sat across the table, silent as always. He'd grown up learning that conflict only led to exhaustion. My brother-in-law was the complete opposite. He spoke loudly, laughed heartily, and liked to dominate any conversation. My sister-in-law smiled at me and judged me behind my back. And my mother-in-law, she silently assessed everything before deciding how to react, as if she were always categorizing people in some invisible system. Dinner started normally. We chatted about work, the economy, superficial things families use when they don't want to talk about real feelings. She was quiet, eating slowly, holding her fork too carefully. At one point she looked at me as if asking permission to be there, and I smiled slightly, just at her, as if to tell her wordlessly that everything was all right. The first comment was disguised as an observation. My brother-in-law said she was very quiet. He smiled as if it were a compliment, but it wasn't. It was the kind of remark that gauges social space. No one responded, and the silence gave him room to continue, saying that children need to be more extroverted, more spontaneous. He didn't finish the sentence, but he didn't need to. I felt his body shrink slightly, almost imperceptibly, but I saw it, because I was paying attention, because I'd seen it before in other places, with other people. It always starts the same way. First the soft phrase, then the test, then the exposure. My mother-in-law joined the conversation with that perfect social smile, saying that some children go through difficult situations and take time to adjust. She spoke looking at me, but clearly talking about herself, as if she were a concept, not a person. She stopped eating. Slowly, she placed her fork on her plate. Too polite for her age. Too polite for that world. Then the laughter started. My brother-in-law raised his glass and said that at least now we had diversity in the family. He laughed heartily. Some laughed with us. Not everyone, but enough to make us remember that moment forever. I looked at her. She looked at the plate. And I remained silent. Not because I agreed, but because in that moment I understood something that no one else there had understood. They were looking at her as if she were just a child with no story. And I had the strange feeling that there was a whole story there hidden, waiting for the right moment to appear. After dinner, I found her sitting on the stairs, hugging her knees and staring at the ground. She asked me quietly if she had done something wrong. That question deeply moved me. There was no anger in her voice, only fear. Fear of being rejected again, without understanding why. I said no. I said I hadn't done anything wrong. And in that moment, without saying it out loud, I made a silent promise. I was going to protect that girl. No matter who, no matter what, no matter what existed before me. That night, as I lay staring at the ceiling in the dark, I still didn't know that the strange feeling in my chest wasn't just indignation about dinner. It was intuition. It was the beginning of a story still hidden in pieces, waiting to be uncovered. And I didn't know it yet, but that had been the last night I would believe that his past was simple. In the following days, life tried to return to normal, as it always does after uncomfortable moments. School, a rushed breakfast, a backpack left on the chair, homework scattered on the kitchen table. But something had changed inside me. It wasn't paranoia. It was awareness. I began to notice small things I might not have noticed before. The way I always looked over my shoulder when entering a new place. The way I expressed gratitude for the simplest things, as if I were still surprised to have them. One afternoon, when I went to pick her up from school, I noticed she took a few seconds longer to come out. It wasn't fear. It was that look of someone who always makes sure she's safe before taking the next step. When she saw me, she smiled, came running, and in that moment, she seemed like a normal child. But on the way home, she was quieter than usual, staring out the window, watching the movement of the streets as if she were thinking about something she couldn't yet explain. When we arrived, she went straight to her room to do her homework. I stayed in the kitchen trying to work, but my attention was constantly divided, as if a part of me was waiting for something to happen. That's when I realized that dinner had planted a seed inside me that I could no longer ignore. It wasn't just what they were saying. It was the feeling that there were parts of their story that no one had properly told. That night, while I was putting away the dishes, he appeared in the kitchen doorway with a drawing. It was a house. Big, colorful, with too many windows for the size of the structure. I asked him why so many windows, and he told me that houses with lots of windows let light in from all sides. That stayed with me for hours, because for the first time, I thought that maybe his story was exactly like that. Full of parts that no one saw, but that tied everything together. A few days later, something insignificant happened, but it was enough to alarm me. When she opened her backpack to take out her notebook, a folded piece of paper fell out, clearly not school supplies. I picked it up and slowly unfolded it. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't scary. It was just a handwritten phrase. Some stories always come back. It had no title, no explanation, nothing more than that. I asked her if someone had given it to her. She said no, that she just found it in her backpack when she went to get her pencil case. It could have been a joke. It could have been a coincidence. But something inside me told me it wasn't. I didn't panic. I didn't show any fear. I simply put the paper away. That night, after she fell asleep, I sat at the kitchen table, looking at that sentence over and over. It wasn't aggressive. It wasn't urgent. But it was too personal to be casual. And for the first time since dinner, I felt that same strange feeling return. As if something were stirring deep within her story. Not to hurt. Not to invade. But to surface. The next day, while we were having coffee, she asked me something that echoed in my head for the rest of the day. She asked if people can miss things they don't remember well. I asked her why. She said that sometimes she feels a strange longing, but she doesn't know why. I smiled and told her that it happens sometimes, but inside I felt an inexplicable weight. At that moment, I understood that perhaps her story wasn't just hidden in old documents or papers. Perhaps it was hidden in sensations, in nameless feelings, in questions that arise before the answers exist. And that night, when I turned off the lights and went to watch her sleep, I had a quiet certainty. That story hadn't revealed everything yet. And when it did, I needed to be ready to hold her hand as she understood every part. And it was there that I realized that feeling wasn't fear of the past. It was preparation for when the past finally decided to reappear. A few days after that note appeared in my backpack, the routine continued, but I couldn't see things the same way anymore. It wasn't constant anxiety, it wasn't panic. It was as if my mind had switched to a mode of silent observation. I started noticing small patterns, things that maybe anyone else would ignore. The way I always chose to sit near the exit in new places. The way I took an extra second before trusting someone new. It wasn't a visible trauma. It was an old adaptation. One ordinary afternoon, while I was doing chores at the kitchen table, the phone rang. Unknown number. I almost let it ring until it stopped, but something inside me told me to answer. On the other end, there was silence for a few seconds, then a calm male voice asked if I was her legal guardian. My body tensed instantly, but I kept my voice steady and said yes. He took a deep breath and said that she might be contacted in the coming months by people trying to organize old files linked to some institutions. He said it wasn't a threat, that it wasn't urgent, but that he thought she should know beforehand. I asked her who she was. She said she'd been working for years organizing old files and had seen something that reminded her of my case. She made it clear that there was no investigation against me or anyone in my current family. It was simply a reorganization of historical records. But before hanging up, she said something that stuck with me. Some stories only emerge when life is already strong enough to bear them. I hung up and stood in the kitchen, staring blankly for a few seconds. When I looked up at her, she was still deep in her homework, chewing on the tip of her pencil like she always did when she was thinking. That brought me back to the present. Because at that moment, she was just a little girl doing her math homework, with no idea that there might be a bigger story behind her own life. That night, after she fell asleep, I sat at the table with the note from my backpack, replaying the call in my mind. It didn't seem like a threat. It didn't seem like a scam. It seemed like a warning. And for the first time, I realized that maybe her story wasn't hidden out of malice. Maybe it was hidden because, at some point, no one knew any better. A few days later, something else happened. While organizing old documents at home, I found the folder with the adoption papers. I'd seen it several times. But this time, looking at it with fresh eyes, I noticed details that had previously seemed like mere bureaucracy. Dates that were too close together. Transfers with little explanation. Nothing illegal. Nothing wrong. But too rushed to be just a coincidence. That night, she appeared at my bedroom door and asked if she could sleep there. I said yes. She lay down, stared at the ceiling, and then asked if anyone before me had tried to take care of her. That took me by surprise, but I kept my voice calm. I told her that sometimes, before someone comes into your life, other people may have tried to help in any way they could. She was silent, absorbing it, and then simply said, "So they never really forgot me?" I took a deep breath and said no. I said that human stories are complicated, but that her presence meant that many things had happened to protect her, even when she was too young to understand. She fell asleep soon after, but I lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, pondering the weight of that question. Because, in that moment, I realized that her story wouldn't just be uncovered in files or phone calls. It was going to emerge in her questions, at her own pace, in her own way. And there, in that silent early morning, I understood that perhaps her past wasn't returning to take anything away. Perhaps it was returning to be understood. And when that happened, I needed to make sure she never felt she was facing it alone. Because, ultimately, the greatest protection I could offer wasn't hiding the story. It was making sure that, when it came to light, it came out with care. The call haunted me for days, but I didn't panic or desperately search for answers. I simply realized that perhaps, at some point, someone would come forward with pieces of her story I didn't yet know. And, strangely enough, that didn't just scare me. It left me with a sense of responsibility I'd never felt before. As if I'd been chosen not only to look after her present, but to help her navigate her past when the time came. A week later, when I got home in the early afternoon, I found a plain envelope in the mailbox. It had no return address. Nothing was written on it except my name and address. My heart was pounding, but I didn't open it right away. I went inside, made some coffee, took a deep breath, sat down at the kitchen table, and only then did I open it. Inside, there were copies of old documents. Incomplete. Not official enough to be considered legal proof of anything, but real enough to show that there was more history than I knew. Among them was an old record with blurred sections, showing a name that wasn't the current one. It wasn't entirely legible, but it was there. It wasn't a typo. It was another record. Next to the papers, there was only one typed sentence. "This doesn't change who she is today. But maybe it will help her when she wants to understand where she comes from." That wasn't a threat. It wasn't blackmail. It was information. Powerful. Human. Irreversible. I stared at those papers for several minutes, trying to imagine how many decisions had been made about her life before she was old enough to remember anything. I didn't feel anger. I didn't feel despair. I felt sadness for that little version of herself who probably just wanted someone constant. When she got home from school that day, she excitedly told me she'd been chosen to read a text aloud to the class. That simple joy made me understand something with brutal clarity. Her life was happening right now. The past might have been complex, it might have been full of layers, but her present was real, solid, built day by day. That night, after he fell asleep, I sat down at the table and calmly reread the documents. There were references to transfers between institutions in very short periods. Nothing illegal. Nothing to indicate a mistake. But clearly something had been done too quickly. As if someone were trying to resolve a difficult situation without having time to do everything properly. In the following days, another message appeared on my cell phone. Unknown number. Text only. If someone contacts you officially, it's not to push them away. It's to close open chapters. I didn't reply, but I kept it in mind. One night, while I was tidying the kitchen, she came in and asked me if people can have more than one beginning in life. I asked her why. She said that sometimes she feels there's a part of her she doesn't remember, but she feels it exists. I sat down across from her and told her that some people really do have stories that begin more than once. And that doesn't make them any less complete. Sometimes it makes them stronger. She remained silent for a few seconds and then simply said, "So, is it okay if I don't understand everything now?" I said yes, that nobody needs to understand their whole story all at once. That night, when I went to watch her sleep, I had a new feeling. It wasn't fear that the past would resurface. It was the certainty that, when it fully came to the surface, she would be ready. And there, watching her breathe calmly, I realized that her story wasn't returning to disturb the present. It was returning, perhaps, someday, to give meaning to parts of her that had always existed in silence. After that envelope, I stopped seeing everything as an isolated coincidence. I didn't become paranoid, but I began to accept that perhaps there was an invisible thread connecting her present to decisions made long before I entered her life. And, for the first time, I didn't feel the need to search for answers. I felt I needed to be prepared for when they were found for me. A few days later, I received another call from an unknown number. This time there was no initial silence. The male voice introduced himself, said he worked reviewing historical records from old institutions, and asked if I would be willing to speak publicly. His tone wasn't intrusive. It was respectful, even discreet. I asked if it had anything to do with the documents that had arrived at my house. He said it probably did, but he couldn't explain everything over the phone. We agreed to meet at a cafe downtown, an open, busy, and neutral place. When I arrived, he was already there, unassuming, calm, with the look of someone used to dealing with difficult situations. He didn't start with the paperwork. He began by asking how she was, if she seemed safe, if she was settling in well. That put me on alert, but it also made me realize that perhaps it wasn't just about bureaucracy. He explained that in recent years some old files were being reorganized. These were not investigations, not legal reviews, just a reorganization of incomplete histories. He said that, in some cases, children's records had been kept more than once, due to difficult circumstances, and that this could create historical gaps. Then he placed a folder on the table and slowly opened it. Inside were copies of incomplete records that showed exactly what I had already noticed. There was a history before the official record that I knew about. It wasn't a crime. It wasn't a scandal. It was human disorganization in trying to resolve complex situations too quickly. I asked if anyone was looking for her. She said there was no record of any active searches. Only old searches were being reviewed. She said that, in most cases, this only becomes relevant when the person, as an adult, decides to seek answers about their own origins. Before leaving, he said something that stuck with me. He said that stories like this don't come back to take anything away from anyone. They come back to fill in what was left unexplained. When I got home that day, she was sitting drawing in the living room. When she saw me, she got up, ran over, and hugged me naturally. And in that moment, I felt a profound certainty. Whatever existed before me didn't change what existed there. That night, after she fell asleep, I kept thinking about what it means for a child to grow up without knowing all the parts of their own story. Not as something tragic, but as something incomplete. And I realized that perhaps the best gift I could give her wasn't to hide the past from her, but to make sure that, when she was ready, the whole story would be there for her to understand. A few days later, while I was doing chores at the kitchen table, she asked me something simple, but it changed me completely. She asked me if some people come into our lives forever, even if they can't stay from the beginning. I took a deep breath and said yes. That sometimes life is full of difficult paths, but that doesn't erase the fact that every person who truly cared about us leaves a good mark. She smiled slightly, as if she understood more than what she was saying, and went back to her task. And at that moment, I realized that her story wasn't returning as a threat. It was returning as a memory, as a missing piece, as part of who she always was, even before she could remember. And for the first time since it all began, I felt that perhaps we weren't chasing the past. Perhaps the past was simply waiting for the right moment to be understood. After that meeting in the coffee shop, I stopped expecting quick or complete answers. I understood that it was a story that unfolded in layers, as if each piece could only appear once the previous one had been accepted. And strangely enough, that brought me a new calm. It wasn't passivity. It was preparation. A few days later, when I got home from work, I found another envelope in the mailbox. Exactly the same as the first one. Plain, No return address. I knew it wasn't a coincidence, but I wasn't alarmed. I went inside, closed the door, put the envelope on the table, and stared at it for a few seconds before opening it. Inside were copies of even older records. Poor quality scans, missing pieces, protected sections. But now there was something new. A clearer timeline. There were records that showed that, in her early years, someone had at least tried to get up-to-date information about her situation. Not an attempt to expel her. Not an attempt to question her status. Just an attempt to find out if she was safe. This affected me in an unexpected way. It didn't frighten me. It filled me with humanity. Because it meant that, at some point, there was someone who cared about her well-being, even if they couldn't be there for her afterward. Alongside the documents was another simple phrase. Not all broken stories are about abandonment. Sometimes it's simply a lack of choice. I stared at that sentence for several minutes, because it completely changed my perspective. Perhaps her story wasn't just about loss. Perhaps it was also about imperfect attempts to protect someone in impossible circumstances. When she got home from school that day, she told me about a new activity. They had to create a timeline of their own lives with drawings and memories. She said she wanted to include the day she came home, the first friend she made at her new school, and the day she learned to ride a bike. That brought me a deep peace, because it showed that her identity was being built in the present, with real, lived memories. That night, after he fell asleep, I sat down at the table and calmly reread everything. It no longer seemed like a sequence of coincidences. It seemed as if history were rearranging itself, not against me, not against him, but in favor of something that had remained unexplained in the past. A few days later, she received another message on her cell phone. It simply said, "What's happening now doesn't change what you have today. It only prevents you from one day feeling like you have no origins." I didn't reply, but I saved it. A week later, she came into the kitchen while I was washing the dishes and asked me if sometimes you can love someone, even when you can't be near them. I asked her why she was thinking that. She said she couldn't explain it. She just felt it. I turned off the tap, sat down across from her, and said yes. That sometimes life separates people who would have liked to stay together. But that doesn't erase the affection that existed. She remained silent, absorbing it all, and then simply said, "So, some people do care about us, even from afar?" I said yes. That night, when I went to watch her sleep, I felt something I hadn't felt since the beginning of this story. It wasn't fear of the past. It was respect for it. Because, for the first time, I began to believe that perhaps her story wasn't made up solely of losses. And there, watching her sleep peacefully, I understood that perhaps some stories don't return to hurt. They return to finally be understood. After that second envelope, I stopped pretending it was insignificant. It wasn't just curiosity about the past anymore. It was the distinct feeling that parts of her story had been left unfinished and were now slowly returning, as if respecting her time, my time, the time of the life we built together. Outwardly, the days continued as normal. School, work, shopping, chores scattered on the kitchen table. But inwardly, there was a constant awareness. Not tension. Simply aware. Like someone who knows they're close to something important and doesn't want to rush into it. One afternoon, while organizing old documents around the house, I found a folder with photos from the first few months after she arrived. Simple photos, nothing professional, just everyday moments. Her on the sofa, holding a glass of juice too big for her small hands, sleeping wrapped in an old blanket she never wanted to change. And it was there that I realized something that stopped me in my tracks. In most of the photos, even the oldest ones, she already had that watchful gaze. It wasn't a fearful look. It was the look of someone who had already learned to observe before trusting. And for the first time, I felt a quiet sadness for the little version of herself who perhaps never had time to simply be carefree. That night, after dinner, she sat on the living room floor and began to assemble a jigsaw puzzle. I sat beside her, silently. simply helping her fit the pieces together. After a few minutes, she spoke to me without looking at me. Do you think people can miss someone they don't even remember well? That struck me deeply, but I kept my voice calm. I asked her what she meant. She shrugged and said that sometimes she feels a strange longing, but she can't explain why. It didn't sound like sadness. It sounded like emotional curiosity. I said that sometimes the heart clings to things the head doesn't yet understand, and that there's nothing wrong with that. She remained silent for a few seconds and then reassembled the puzzle. But something shifted within me at that moment, because it was no longer a story about archives, documents, or anonymous messages. It was a story about identity, about emotional memory, about how some parts of our history continue to exist within us even when we can't explain them. A few days later, I received another message on my cell phone. Just a text message. Records show someone was consistently present during the early years. Not invasive, just caring. I stared at that sentence for several minutes. It didn't seem like a threat. It didn't seem like manipulation. It seemed acknowledgement. That day, when she got home from school, she started talking about an art project. They had to draw something that represented a safe place. She drew a house with many windows and a large tree in front. I asked her why the tree. She said that trees are strong because they have roots that no one sees. That night, after she fell asleep, I sat in the living room looking at that drawing. And for the first time, I felt something different from the initial fear I felt when it all began. I felt a strange gratitude, not for the difficult circumstances, but for the fact that, somehow, I had survived it all and could still draw safety, home roots. And there, in the silence of the house, I realized that perhaps her story no longer showed pain. Perhaps it showed that, even on difficult paths, someone tried to take care of her. And perhaps, deep down, that was one of the most important things I would ever need to know. After that message about constant presence in the early years, I stopped trying to fit everything into a simple logic. I began to accept that perhaps their story was made up of difficult decisions made by people who may never have had the time, the resources, or the option to get everything right. And for the first time, I felt less overwhelmed and more human. A few days later, I received another call from the same man I had met in the coffee shop. He asked if I could see him again. He said they had found additional records that helped reconstruct a clearer timeline of his early years. It wasn't official information for me. It was more so that I wouldn't be caught off guard in the future should I ever decide to look for answers. We met in the same place. This time she brought a thinner folder. Inside were records of previous authorized visits. Full names weren't revealed, but patterns emerged. The same initials appeared at different times. The same number of times. The same description of behavior. Quiet presence, questions about routine, concern about adjustment. What struck me most was a small observation on one of the pages. Demonstrates a consistent emotional bond. It seemed too simple to carry so much weight, but it did. Because it showed that someone hadn't just appeared once. Someone had tried to be present as much as possible. I asked if there were any recent records of this person. He said no. He said it was ancient history. But he also said that, in many cases, stories like that don't disappear. They remain dormant until the person themselves, as they grow up, decides to understand where they came from. When I got home that day, she was in the living room doing her homework, focused as always. When she saw me, she smiled that way that always made the world seem simple. And in that moment, I realized something very clear. Regardless of how many stories had existed before, her life was happening right there. That night, while I was washing the dishes, she appeared and asked me if it's possible to love someone even when you're not physically close. I turned off the tap and sat down across from her. I told her yes, that sometimes life separates people, but that doesn't erase the affection that existed. She remained silent for a few seconds and then asked, "So, could someone have liked me before, even if I don't remember?" I took a deep breath and said yes. She didn't cry. She wasn't sad. She simply absorbed it, as if it were a new piece slowly fitting into her inner puzzle. That night, after he fell asleep, I sat in the living room, staring blankly ahead, and realized that something had changed inside me. I was no longer afraid of his past. I was beginning to respect it, because, for the first time, it seemed clear that perhaps their story wasn't just about loss. Perhaps it was also about quiet attempts at care that didn't manage to become a permanent presence, but that nonetheless existed. And there, in that silence, I realized that the story was entering a new phase. It was no longer about discovering whether someone had existed in her past. It was about understanding who that person had been and what that would mean when, one day, she wanted to know everything. After that second meeting in the coffee shop, something changed in me forever. It wasn't just about piecing things together anymore. It was about accepting that, at some point, their story would stop being fragments and become whole. And for the first time, I began to feel that moment approaching. The days passed normally on the outside. School, work, supermarket, chores, laundry, everyday life. But inside, there was a new awareness, as if I were walking alongside a story that hadn't yet been fully revealed, but that was already present. One afternoon, when I got home, I found her sitting on the floor of her room, rummaging through an old toy box. It was a box we almost never opened, full of things she brought with her when she came into my life. Simple toys, some already worn, others clearly not hers. I sat down beside her and helped her move things. Among the toys was a small, faded teddy bear with an old seam along one side. I'd seen that bear before, but I'd never paid much attention to it. She held it, looked at it for a few seconds, and said, "I think this teddy bear was mine before." That made my heart race, but I kept my voice calm. I asked him why he thought that. He shrugged and said he couldn't explain it. It just seemed familiar. That night, after he fell asleep, I went to the toy chest and picked up the teddy bear. I examined it closely. It had no tag. It had no name. But it showed clear signs of having been cared for a long time before arriving there. A few days later, I received another message. Just a text. There is a possibility that old personal items may still exist in physical archives. That chilled me to the bone and, at the same time, brought me a strange sense of confirmation. Because, for the first time, there was a possibility that something concrete existed. Something physical. Something that someone had left behind thinking about their future. I didn't reply, but I saved the message. That week, she started a school project about her own life story. She asked me for help organizing the photos. While we were sorting them, she asked me, "Do you think that before I was here, someone already wanted me to be okay?" I felt a lump in my throat, but I answered calmly. I said that sometimes, even when people can't be together, it doesn't mean they don't care. She remained silent for a few seconds and then simply said, "So maybe I always had someone supporting me." That night, after he fell asleep, I sat in the living room with a teddy bear in my hand and realized something with absurd clarity. Perhaps his story wasn't returning to show abandonment. Perhaps it was returning to show that, even in difficult situations, someone was trying to move beyond caregiving. And for the first time since it all began, I felt something more than concern. I felt respect. Because some stories are not just about those who managed to stay. Sometimes those who tried do it too. After that week of studying, something inside me fell silent. Not the silence of fear. The silence of understanding. As if I already knew that the next part of the story wouldn't be a mere coincidence, but something more concrete. And for the first time, I felt that perhaps I was ready for it. A few days later, I received a different message. It wasn't just any sentence. It was direct information. There is confirmation that some of the old personal items are still physically archived. I stared at that message for several minutes. It wasn't a promise. It wasn't a guarantee of recovery. But it was confirmation of his existence. It meant that something from the beginning of his story still existed somewhere in the physical world. Kept safe. Preserved. not lost. That same day, I received a call from the man at the coffee shop. He spoke calmly, saying it was still a technical process, but that they had located physical storage records linked to the same period as the documents that had already been released. He said it wasn't something to get my hopes up about yet, but that it was important for me to know there was a real possibility that something concrete existed. After hanging up, I stood in the kitchen, staring blankly for a few seconds. It wasn't a surprise. It was that profound feeling that her story was ceasing to be just an invisible memory and beginning to touch the real world. When she got home from school that day, she excitedly told me about a presentation she had the following week. That simple joy reminded me of what truly mattered. Her life was happening now, and nothing from the past would change that. That night, after he fell asleep, I sat at the table with a teddy bear beside me and thought about what it meant for someone years ago to have left them something physical. Not as an obligation, not as a sign of possession, but as a memory, as a gesture. A few days later, another message arrived. Just a text. The object described in the old records was not discarded. It was preserved. That made my heart race. Not because I needed that to validate anything, but because it meant that at some point someone made the conscious decision not to let that part of their story disappear. The following week, she appeared in the kitchen while I was preparing dinner and asked me something that completely took me by surprise. She asked if objects could hold the feelings of those who gave them as gifts. I asked her why she thought that. She said that sometimes she feels certain things are important even without knowing why. I said that sometimes objects become memories, not because they're magical, but because someone imbued them with feeling when they gave them as a gift. She remained silent, absorbing everything, and then returned to the room. That night, when I went to check on her while she slept, I realized something so clearly that it took my breath away. Her story wasn't returning to ruin the present. It was returning as something that, perhaps someday, would help her understand that she was never just a lost child amidst the decisions of adulthood. And there, watching her sleep peacefully, I understood that the next part of the story would not just be about knowing that something existed. It would be about discovering where she was and what it would mean when one day he arrived there. After confirming that something was physically preserved, I stopped trying to imagine scenarios. I understood that it was no longer a theory nor a distant hypothesis. It was reality stored somewhere, waiting for the opportune moment. And, for the first time since it all began, I felt a strange calm, as if its story ceased to be a fragment and became a continuous line. A few days later, the man from the coffee shop called me again. This time, his voice had a different tone, but it wasn't urgency. It was concern. He said they had managed to confirm that the item registered years before was linked to a specific batch of personal files that had remained outside the digital system for a long time. It wasn't something that would be handed over to him. It wasn't something that would change his life now. But it was confirmation of its real existence. I thanked her, hung up, and stayed in the room for a few minutes, trying to process it all. It wasn't an explosive emotion. It was that profound feeling of knowing that an invisible part of her story had never been erased. When she got home from school that day, she started talking about a test, laughing, complaining about math, talking too fast as she always did when she was excited. And in that moment, looking at her there, alive, present, full of simple life, I understood something powerfully. Her past might have deep layers, but who she was being built right there, every day. That night, while we were having dinner, she told me about a new activity at school. They were talking about identity, about who we are. And she said something that deeply impacted me. She said she believed that people aren't only defined by where they come from. They're also defined by who they're with. I smiled, but inside I felt something that seemed almost like relief. A few days later, I received another message on my cell phone. Just a text message. The record indicates that the item was retained by human decision, not by an automated protocol. That made me close my eyes for a few seconds, because it meant that someone, consciously, decided it shouldn't be discarded. Someone decided that that part of their story deserved to continue existing. That week, while I was folding laundry in the living room, she sat on the sofa next to me and asked, "Do you think someone could have thought about me before they met me?" I took a deep breath and said yes. That sometimes there are people who care about us even before we understand the world. She remained silent for a few seconds and then simply leaned against me, as if that answer had filled some silent part inside her. That night, after she fell asleep, I sat in the living room and understood something with a clarity I'd never felt before. Perhaps her story wasn't about abandonment. Perhaps it was about difficult circumstances in which someone tried to provide as much care as possible, even without being able to stay. And there, in that profound silence of the house, I understood that the next part of the story would no longer be just about the existence of the past. It would be about understanding who tried to protect her, even when they couldn't be there. And for the first time I felt that maybe that answer really did exist. After confirming that the object had been preserved by human decision, I felt the story was getting closer to something bigger. It was no longer just about records or emotional assumptions. It was about real people who, at some point, made decisions with their future in mind. And that completely changed my perspective on everything that had come before. A few days later, the man from the coffee shop called me again. This time, he didn't talk about documents. He talked about context. He said that, by comparing old records, it became clear that someone had tried to monitor his situation consistently during his early years. Not just anyone, not someone distant. Someone with a clear emotional connection, documented in old observations. She made it very clear that there was no record of any recent attempts to contact her, nor of anything that might change her current life. But she said it was important for me to know that in her medical history, she had received ongoing care from a specific person. That relieved me, because it confirmed something I was already beginning to suspect. After hanging up, I stood for a few minutes looking out the kitchen window, thinking about how many human stories are caught between what was felt and what could be done in that moment. Not everyone who loves can stay. Not everyone who wants to protect can stay. But that doesn't mean the feeling never existed. When she got home from school that day, she told me they were studying family history. She said she found it strange that people always only want to know who raised us, but not who encouraged us when we didn't even know who we were. That really struck me, because I felt like I was touching on the heart of her own story without even realizing it. That night, after she fell asleep, I sat in the living room and thought about what it means to grow up and one day discover that there were people who try to take care of you even when they couldn't stay. Not as a substitute for anyone, but as part of their human story. A few days later, another message arrived. Just a text. The pattern indicates the recurring presence of the same person during critical moments in the early years. That brought me a strange sense of peace, because it took her story out of the realm of chance. It showed that there was intention. There was effort. There was someone who saw her not as just another case, but as a specific girl who mattered. That week, while we were having dinner, she asked me something that made time stand still for a few seconds. She asked me if there are sometimes people who help us to exist, even though they can't be there for us forever. I took her hand and said yes. That sometimes there are people who are part of the beginning of our story and others who accompany us later, and that neither erases the other. She remained silent for a few seconds and then simply said, "So maybe I always had more people supporting me than I thought." That night, when I went to watch her sleep, I felt something I had never felt since it all began. It wasn't fear of the past. It wasn't anxiety about the future. It was a deep respect for her entire story, because for the first time, it seemed clear that their story had not been built solely on loss. It had also been built through quiet attempts at care. And there, in that silence, I realized that the next part of the story would no longer be about discovering if someone existed. It would be about accepting that someone really existed. After that confirmation of someone's recurring presence in her early years, something in me definitively changed. It was no longer about discovering whether someone existed in her past. It was about understanding how and when that truth should become part of her conscious history. For the first time, I felt fear, not of the past itself, but of telling it the wrong way, at the wrong time, in the wrong way. The days went by as usual. School, routine, homework, laughter, little arguments about assignments. But inside me, there was a silent conflict I couldn't ignore. I wanted to protect her, but I also knew that protecting someone doesn't mean erasing part of their history. Some nights I lay awake thinking, when she asks me directly, do I tell her everything? Do I tell her only part of it? Do I wait until she's older? Do I prepare her little by little? There was no instruction manual for that. There was only love and responsibility. A few days later, the man from the coffee shop called me again. This time he didn't bring any documents. He just said something that stuck in my head for days. The worst thing someone can feel is not pain over the past. It's feeling that their own history has been hidden from them. That impacted me in an unexpected way. Because, at that moment, I realized that protecting her couldn't mean lying to her. It meant making sure the truth reached her carefully, with structure and with love. When I got home that day, she was sitting on the sofa reading. When she saw me, she gave me that simple smile that always made me feel safe. And in that moment, I felt the weight of the decision I would one day have to make. That night, while we were having dinner, she asked me something that made me realize that day might not be so far off. She asked me if people sometimes need to know their own history to understand who they are. I asked her what she meant. She said that sometimes she felt there were parts of her she couldn't explain. It wasn't sadness. It was curiosity. It was an identity that longed to fully exist. I took a deep breath and said that some people discover parts of their own story little by little, and that this doesn't change who they are, it just helps them understand their own path. She remained silent for a few seconds and then simply said, I think I want to know everything someday. That night, after he fell asleep, I sat in the living room and cried for the first time since it all began. Not from sadness, but from the weight of understanding that loving someone also means accepting that one day they will want to know every detail of their own story. A few days later, I received another message on my cell phone. Just a text message. Her story was never erased. It was just waiting for the right moment. I read it several times, because at that moment, I understood something that changed everything inside me. I didn't need to decide when the truth would come out. I just needed to make sure that when she was ready, I would find the truth carefully. And that night, watching her sleep, I made her a silent promise. She would never hide who she was. But I would make sure she found out who he is, fearless. After accepting that one day she would want to know everything, the conflict within me began to shift. Before, it was fear of how to protect her from the past. Now it was about how to prepare her so that the past wouldn't arrive as something terrifying, but as a natural part of her story. And this change brought with it an even greater responsibility, because I knew that when that moment came, it couldn't be improvised. The days passed simply. School, routine, conversations in the kitchen, laughter on the sofa watching silly things. But I began to pay even closer attention to her questions. Not as someone trying to avoid answers, but as someone trying to understand her emotional rhythm. One afternoon, while we were organizing old photos for a school project, she was looking at one of the pictures from the first few months after she came home. She ran her finger over the image, thoughtfully, and asked me if I remembered what I looked like before she came. It wasn't a serious question, just quiet curiosity. But it was then that I realized the moment was approaching. I told her I knew some details from the records and from the people who had cared for her before. And I told her that whenever she wanted to know more, we could talk calmly. She just nodded, as if that was enough for now. That night, after she fell asleep, I sat at the kitchen table and reread everything that had come into my hands since the beginning. Documents, messages, notes. For the first time, I felt no weight. I felt order. as if her story were no longer a collection of loose pieces and was beginning to take shape as something that could be told with respect. A few days later, the man from the coffee shop called me again. He said he didn't have anything new regarding the files, but he said something that stuck with me. Human stories don't need to be perfect to be true. They just need to be told with care. That brought me a strange peace, because I realized I didn't need to have all the perfect answers. I just needed to have truth and presence. That week, while we were having dinner, she asked me if people can sometimes have more than one beginning and still be the same person. I told her yes, that we are made up of everything we have lived through and everything we have chosen to live through since then. She remained silent for a few seconds and then simply said, "I think I'll want to know, but not now." And that brought me profound relief, because it meant she was listening to her own inner rhythm. That night, after she fell asleep, I sat in the living room and realized something that made me take a deep breath. Her past wasn't a shadow behind us. It was a part of her story, waiting to be integrated. A few days later, I received another message on my cell phone. Just a text message. When she wants to know, the whole story will be there. I kept it, not as a warning, as a silent promise that his story had not been forgotten. And that night, watching her sleep, I understood something with a clarity that brought me peace. My role was never to protect her from the truth. My role has always been to ensure that the truth comes to light, with love. After that conversation where she said she might want to know but not yet, I stopped trying to predict the exact moment it would all happen. I understood that the decision wasn't mine. It was hers. And, for the first time since the beginning, I felt the story was entering a calmer phase. Not one of absence, but of maturation. The days passed with a lightness I hadn't felt in a long time. She was still herself, laughing heartily at simple things, complaining about difficult tasks, recounting anecdotes from school as if every detail mattered. And that reminded me every day that her identity wasn't anchored in the past. It was being built right there in real life. One afternoon, while we were tidying his room, he found the old toy box again. This time, he picked up the teddy bear, the one that had always seemed familiar to him, and sat on the bed, hugging it silently for a few seconds. She asked me if we can sometimes appreciate something without remembering where it came from. I told her yes, that sometimes we feel something is important because, at some point, it was part of our history. She stared at the teddy bear for a few more seconds and then simply said, "So perhaps some things remain with us, even when we don't remember them." That night, after she fell asleep, I sat in the living room and realized something that deeply moved me. She wasn't afraid of the past. She was curious. And curiosity is very different from pain. Curiosity meant that her story wasn't an open wound. It was a question that, someday, she might decide to answer. A few days later, I received another message on my cell phone. Just a text message. The most important thing about his story is not what happened. It's who he became. I read it several times, because it was exactly what I felt, but I could never express it in words. That week, while we were having coffee before going to school, she asked me something that made my heart go completely silent inside. She asked, "When I want to know everything, will you be there with me?" I didn't even have to think about it. I took her hand and said yes. Always. She nodded calmly, as if that was the only answer she needed at that moment. That night, after she fell asleep, I sat in the living room and realized that my biggest fear at the beginning no longer made sense. I wasn't afraid of the truth. I was only afraid of her facing it alone. And now I knew that would never happen. And there, in the quiet silence of the house, I understood that her story was no longer about discovering the past. The aim was to ensure that when she decided to look at him, she would do it without losing who she is. And for the first time since it all began, I felt that the end of this story wouldn't be about difficult answers. It would be about peace. After that breakfast where she asked me if I would be there for her whenever she wanted to know everything, something inside me finally calmed down. Not because the story was over, but because I understood that the most important thing was already secured. She wasn't alone in her own story, and that changed everything. The months passed with a tranquility I never imagined at the beginning. No new messages, no new documents, no new discoveries. And for the first time, this didn't cause me anxiety, because I understood that her story no longer needed to search for answers. The answers existed. They were safe, waiting for their moment. She continued to grow, to change, to gain more self-confidence, more curiosity about the world, more self-awareness. And, along with that, more mature questions began to emerge. Not questions of fear, questions of identity. One night, while we were having dinner, she spoke matter-of-factly, as if she were sharing something that had been brewing inside her for some time. She said that she thought that one day she would like to understand how her own story began. Not to change anything, just to understand. I felt my heart clench, but not from fear, from excitement, because I knew that moment would come. And now I wasn't afraid anymore. It felt natural. I told her that whenever she wanted, we could talk calmly, without rushing, without hiding anything, without making the past bigger than it was. She nodded calmly, as if this were just another part of life yet to be explored. That night, after he fell asleep, I sat in the living room and thought about everything that had happened since that dinner years ago. From the first messages, from the first documents, from the first fear, I felt that the past might steal something from his life. And for the first time I understood with total clarity, his past never came to take anything away from me. He came to complete the picture. A few days later, as we were walking home from school, she said something I'll never forget. She said she found it beautiful that people could be made up of many stories and still be one person. I smiled and told him he was right. That night, as I watched her sleep, I felt a profound peace, because I knew that when the day came that I wanted to know everything, I wouldn't be trying to fill a void. She would be seeking to understand her own strength. And there, in that moment of silence, I realized that his story had reached the place where it was always meant to go. Not in the past. It's not in the documents. Not in the answers. But with the certainty that she was always more than any difficult beginning. If this story touched you in any way, subscribe to the channel and join us on this journey. Here, every story has a purpose, and the next one might be just what you needed to hear today. She was, and always would be, the very continuation of the story itself. Years later, when she was old enough to look at her own story without fear, we sat together one ordinary night, one of those nights when life seems too quiet to hold on to important moments. There was no heavy atmosphere, no dramatic revelations. It was simply a long, sincere conversation, held at the right time. I recounted everything carefully, without exaggerating the past, without idealizing it, without hiding anything. Only the truth, the human truth, imperfect but complete. I spoke of the records, of the attempts to care for her, of the people who were part of the beginning of her story, even though they couldn't stay. She listened in silence. She didn't cry. She didn't rebel. She only asked simple, profound questions, the kind of questions asked by someone who wants to understand, not someone who wants to blame. At one point, she asked me if anyone had actually thought about her before she remembered anything. I told her yes. I told her that there were people who, given the circumstances, tried to ensure her safety, and that this didn't lessen anything that came after. It only made it worse. He remained silent for a few minutes. Then he took a deep breath and said something that has stayed with me forever. She said she found it beautiful to know that her story didn't begin alone. After that, life went on as normal. School became university. Routine became personal choices. She grew, forged friendships, dreams, and goals. And she never let the past become a burden. It became her origin. It became context. It became a part of her, but never her definition. Years later, one afternoon, she told me she had decided not to spend her life trying to understand every detail of her origins. She said that knowing she had received care was enough. That what mattered most was what she decided to do with her life now. That night, alone at home, I understood something with a clarity that only time brings. Her story was never one of abandonment. It was never one of absence. It was one of difficult paths, imperfect human decisions, and of love existing in every possible way. And in the end, the greatest truth of all was simple. She never defined herself by her beginnings. He was defined by his strength to persevere. And there, in the quiet silence of the house, I understood that some stories don't end with answers. They end peacefully. And its story, finally, she had found hers.